Hi everyone, my name is Pfohl. Today I'll be talking to you about our paper titled Net Benefit, Calibration, Threshold Selection, and Training Objectives for Algorithmic Fairness in Healthcare. As a disclosure, this work was completed during the course of my time as a PhD student at Stanford, but I've since completed my PhD and served as a research scientist at Google. To guide the presentation, I'll consider a few key questions. First, I'll focus on how we might come to a set of best practices regarding conducting practical algorithmic fairness assessments for the purposes of evaluating prediction models in healthcare. In that context, I'll discuss how decision-making, or rather the context of decision-making in which the model is used informs the operationalization of algorithmic fairness principles. Second, I'll consider related questions concerning best practices for model development. In that context, I'll consider whether model training objectives should include explicit fairness constraints, as well as the question of how we can build models that predict outcomes well for each patient population. I'll primarily be discussing predictive models derived from electronic health records. To provide some context, the main idea is to build a model to estimate the probability of an outcome within a time horizon following an index event for a particular patient population. We then define a procedure to extract a cohort of patients matching the target population from electronic health record or claims database, and use a variety of clinical data elements to fit a model. The output of the model, called a prediction or a risk estimate or just a score, can then be used to inform clinical decision-making and resource allocation. For a concrete example of a use case, let's consider the estimation of the risk of developing atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease or ASCVD within 10 years. This is an important use case because prevention guidelines recommend the use of a model to predict that risk to inform treatment with statins to reduce blood cholesterol and ultimately the risk of ASCVD. The recommended treatment policy is shown on the slide. The key thing to note is that the prediction or estimate of risk is used to initiate a risk discussion where clinicians and patients jointly reason over the harms and benefit of treatment. The risk discussion is informed by clinical practice guidelines, which provide thresholds and risk categories reflecting the expected benefits and harms of treatment. For the purposes of this talk, I'll primarily consider treatment decisions made at bounds of the intermediate and high-risk categories at 7.5% and 20%, respectively. Now, here are a handful of what are commonly known as algorithmic fairness criteria. Each of them represents some notion of an ideal statistical property of a model, typically some form of parity or invariance in a model performance metric across groups. This presentation will touch on each of these in some capacity, but I'll primarily focus on understanding the tension and incompatibilities between those criteria that operate over the calibration properties of the model and those that assess differences in the true positive and false positive error rates across groups. First, let's focus on a set of conditions defined over the calibration curve. Group calibration is the condition that the model be calibrated for each group, and sufficiency is the condition that the model have the same calibration curve for each group without explicitly requiring calibration of the model. So why is it useful to assess calibration? Well, calibration generally enables informed interpretation of risk estimates as probabilities of the outcome. Sufficiency, which is the fairness criterion that the calibration curves match, is consistent with ensuring that the risk score reflects the same conditional probability of the outcome conditioned on the score across groups. When the model predicts the outcome well for each group, this condition is consistent with treating the set of patients with a given risk of the outcome similarly across groups. In the figure on the right, you can see a set of calibration curves. The x-axis shows the predicted risk, and the y-axis shows the observed incidence of the outcome conditioned on the risk. In this plot, risk is overestimated for the group in blue and underestimated for the group in red. To reason about the fairness implications of using this model, we can look at the points in the calibration curve that intersect the dotted line at 7.5%, which can be thought of as implied thresholds on the risk. At the threshold, the group in red has a higher risk of the outcome conditioned on the risk score than the blue group, implying that the blue group would comparatively be considered for treatment at a lower risk than the red group. We also use the notion of an adjusted threshold, which is the one that results from an adjustment to account for miscalibration. In the figure, the adjusted thresholds correspond to the points at which the curve intersects the dashed horizontal line at 7.5 on the y-axis. As we'll see later in the talk, calibration and sufficiency enable clear reasoning about threshold selection in terms of the consequences of decision-making and patient preference. So here is an example of a set of calibration curves for a model to predict the risk of 10-year ASCVD that we fit using a large commercial claims database. Here there's one curve for each racial and ethnic subgroup under consideration. Note that the primary conclusion that can be drawn from this is that the model is globally overestimating risk for all groups in the clinically relevant range of thresholds. The impact of this is likely the allocation of statins to patients for whom the harms would outweigh the benefits. The plot shows the implied and adjusted thresholds, given that the harm-benefit trade-off would imply a selection of a threshold of either 7.5 or 20%. So here I introduce a simulated example and plot the relationship between some quantities to highlight some key relationships. On the left, you can see the score distributions, which are equal across groups and satisfy the fairness criterion of demographic parity. We plot calibration curves where we have sort of a group in purple, a group in green, and a group in orange, where risk is overestimated for the group in green and underestimated for the group in orange. Next, you'll see the ROC curve, which plots the true positive rates against the false positive rates, where greater area under this curve is generally associated with a higher quality model. Next, you'll see the aggregate utility, which is defined as the expected utility of the decision rule based on treating all patients at or above the threshold and not treating all patients below the threshold. In this case, we use a utility function where there is a certain utility associated with each type of classification error, and the optimal threshold for a calibrated model corresponds to a threshold of 20%. On the right, you'll see the net benefit, which is a related metric that does not require explicit specification of utilities or costs associated with each classification error. Instead, it uses the selected threshold to encode the trade-off between each classification error, and it ultimately represents the resulting aggregate utility measure on a normalized scale. In the figure, I plot the net benefit parameterized with a threshold of 20%. As you can see, the groups do not receive the same amount of aggregate utility or net benefit, but these quantities are maximized for each group at the thresholds adjusted to account for miscalibration. Furthermore, the ordering of the utility and net benefit measures do not reflect the ordering by the AUC of the ROC curve. So let's consider what happens if we imagine recalibrating each of the miscalibrated models. The top row is as before, and the bottom row indicates the result of hypothetical recalibration. As you can see, the score distributions are such that estimates for the orange group are now higher than they were before, consistent with the under and overestimation of the miscalibrated models. The calibration curves indicate perfect calibration. The ROC curves are completely unchanged. The key result, however, is that a single globally consistent threshold maximizes utility and net benefit for each group, regardless of the distribution of the risk score. Now let's take a look at the net benefit of our learned model for ASCVD under the benefit-harm trade-off implied by the choice of threshold of 7.5%. On the left, you can see the net benefit of the miscalibrated model that overestimates the risk of ASCVD, and on the right, you can see the same model under an ideal recalibration procedure. You'll notice that for a miscalibrated model, the choice of threshold of 7.5% achieves lower net benefit for each group than would be achieved by adjusting the threshold to account for miscalibration. For the calibrated model, we note that the utility maximizing threshold is 7.5 for each group, consistent with the construction of the net benefit measure. Let's discuss how these observations regarding calibration and net benefit interact with other popular ways to conduct algorithmic fairness assessments. A popular paradigm is to use the fairness criterion of equalized odds, which requires that the true positive rates and false positive rates be equal across groups. And this plot completes the example we were building earlier with a row corresponding to demographic parity, calibration, and equalized odds. The major new row is the bottom one corresponding to equalized odds. In this case, the score distributions and calibration curves are similar but not identical to those that we see for demographic parity. The ROC curves are equal across subgroups. And for the utility and net benefit curves, note that operating at any fixed threshold on the risk score results in a suboptimal net benefit for at least one group, but adjusting the thresholds to account for this miscalibration would increase net benefit, but would not preserve equalized odds. So to summarize a few key points from this section, first, calibration-based fairness assessment is consistent with the use of the maximum utility decision rule given a fixed model, and further allows for comparisons and differences in the implied thresholds on the risk and conditional utility. An important detail here really is that this argument relies on the preferences and the intervention effectiveness conditioned on risk to not differ across subgroups. Furthermore, as a caveat, calibration-based fairness criteria can be misleading in cases where label bias is present, and you can think of this as a case where there's different measurement error mechanisms across subgroups. Furthermore, calibration as a general concept can be misleading when the model is a poor predictor of the outcome because it's generally possible to recalibrate even poorly fitting models. With regards to equalized odds and demographic parity, it's important to recognize that the true positive rates and false positive rates are properties of the distribution of the risk score conditioned on the outcome, and therefore we should expect differences in these rates across groups whenever these distributions differ. Furthermore, these distributions tend to differ across subgroups when there are different incidences of the outcome, given that the model is calibrated for each group. Finally, differences in these rates may or may not be problematic, but knowing the difference requires assessment of why the rates differ and understanding of how the model is used in context. Now let's talk about model development. As a reminder, we'll primarily consider whether model training objectives should include explicit fairness constraints and also how we can build models that predict outcomes well for each group. So we applied a regularization approach to fitting models to predict the risk of 10-year ASCVD. Higher values for the regularization penalty parameter correspond to a greater penalty on the violation of the threshold-free notion of equalized odds. To see the effect this has on the model, here I plot the calibration curves in the first row, true positive rates in the second row, and the false positive rates in the third row. As you move to the right across the row, you can see the effect of increasing the strength of the penalty. Focusing first on the calibration curves in the top row, you can see the top left cell corresponds to the calibration curves I showed before, where risk is overestimated for every group. As we increase the strength of the penalty, you can actually see qualitative improvements in the calibration curve with minor amounts of regularization. However, for more extreme penalties, we observe an extreme effect on the calibration curve, such that the scores output by the model compress into a narrow band, effectively indicating overestimation of risk for scores below the outcome incidence and underestimation for scores greater than the incidence. For the true positive and false positive rates, you can note that for the unpenalized models, both the true positive and false positive rates are ordered across groups in alignment with the incidence of the outcome across groups. As the strength of the penalty increases, the distance between these curves shrinks in accordance with equalized odds. Consistent with the effect on the calibration curves, we see a compression of the range of predicted scores with high degrees of regularization. Now let's see how these results are reflected in model performance measures. So here we've plotted the area under the RC curve, the log loss, and a measure of calibration error. The bottom row shows the result relative to that obtained for the unpenalized model. Here you can see that the discriminative capabilities of the model monotonically decrease as a function of the penalty, as indicated by the reduction in AUC in each group. On the far right, you can see the calibration curves. The calibration error results are consistent with the results reported in the previous slides, in that we observe improvements in calibration with minor amounts of regularization, with more miscalibration observed for extreme penalties. The values for the log loss, in some sense, represent both of these effects in tandem. So here's a similar graphic for the net benefit of the model for the benefit-harm trade-offs implied by the use of a threshold of 7.5 or 20%. The second and fourth rows, or fourth column, reflect the calibrated net benefit that follows from operating at an adjusted threshold based on the observed miscalibration. The key thing to note here is that the primary effects in the net benefit are driven by the calibration of the model. For small amounts of regularization, the adjusted net benefit is largely stable with even some minor improvements. However, the net benefit sharply declines with large amounts of regularization. However, if we control for the miscalibration by adjusting the threshold for all models, we see the unpenalized ERM model confers the most net benefit with a monotonic decrease as the strength of the penalty increases. Finally, we can see in blue that the variability in the true positive and false positive rates at our thresholds does decrease as the strength of the penalty increases. However, as shown by the orange curves, these effects are not preserved under the threshold adjustment procedure to account for miscalibration. Models trained with equalized odds-based penalties typically confer less net benefit than unpenalized ERM after accounting for any miscalibration, finding that if any apparent benefits are derived from the minor miscalibration of the unpenalized ERM model, we find that extreme equalized odds penalties reduce predicted performance, introduce miscalibration, or introduce differences in applied thresholds across subgroups. These effects reduce net benefit compared to preference concordant threshold selection applied to a calibrated model. We performed an additional experiment where we aimed to understand whether we could expect to improve on standard learning paradigms with training objectives that reason over differences in performance metrics across groups. We used regularized learning objectives that penalize differences in the AUC or log loss across groups, as well as distributionally robust optimization approaches formulated to optimize for the worst case AUC or log loss across groups. We compare these approaches to ERM applied to the entire population or separately for each group. In the interest of time, I'll summarize the results of these experiments. We find that overall, no approach generally outperforms the use of ERM applied to the entire population in terms of overall disaggregated or worst case model performance or net benefit measures. Stratified training, as well as the AUC-based DRO approach, did approve on calibration in some cases. These improvements in calibration result in improvements in net benefit, but these are not preserved after miscalibration is accounted for. So to summarize some key takeaways and recommendations, first off, it's important to transparently document all protocols regarding dataset preparation, core construction, and model development, as well as any assumptions implicit in the problem formulation, which include those related to the intended stakeholders and their values in the intervention and its effectiveness, as well as the relationship between unmeasured constructs and their operationalizations via measurable proxies. For model development, it turns out that maximizing net benefit for each population generally coincides with learning the best fitting set of models that are calibrated at the relevant thresholds for each population. Training one model with empirical risk minimization over the entire population appears to work well for this goal, especially after accounting for any miscalibration. For evaluation, it's important to report a variety of performance metrics and to contextualize these metrics in terms of the properties of the intervention in order to understand model performance holistically. For fairness, we find that calibration-based assessments are generally more useful than those that assess differences in true positive or false positive error rates. This is because in the case that the outcome instance differs, such differences are present in cases when the outcome ascertainment is unbiased and decisions are made on the basis of a calibrated score to confer maximal net benefit for each population. However, in cases where such differences point to unexpected differences in incidence, this could potentially help alert for potential measurement biases. Furthermore, it's important to not over-rely on any assessment of fairness as a sole indicator of whether machine learning-enabled intervention is equity-promoting or introduces harm, but rather the results should be used to motivate any further refitting, recalibration, data collection, or sensitivity analysis, or revisiting of the problem formulation. Finally, current approaches to algorithmic fairness are relatively limited in scope, but can still be useful for model reporting or auditing. It's important to remember that current approaches do not readily enable detection and mitigation of upstream biases, nor enable reasoning over the effects of model-guided interventions on health outcomes or on the mechanisms that contribute to health disparities. As such, machine learning-guided systems and policies that are apparently fair can still introduce and perpetuate harms, just as those that are apparently unfair may not be inherently harmful. An important future direction in this space is to develop formal approaches to integrate knowledge or assumptions regarding the broader system that a model is deployed within into all stages of the data science workflow, from the earliest stages of problem formulation to the evaluation of deployed systems.